Assalamu alaikum. We will begin with lecture 18 today. In the last lecture I discussed the first poem by Matthew Arnold with you, and today I will look at the other two poems by Matthew Arnold. The first one is called The Last Word and the second one is called Growing Old. Before I go on to these two poems in today's lecture, let us just briefly recap what the previous poem was about. Now, in the previous poem which I discussed with you, which was called The Dover Beach, in that poem we saw how Matthew Arnold is a representative poet of his age. We saw how he talks about the problems, he talks about the dilemma facing his own age, and as he sees it, the greatest challenge facing his age, that is the Victorian age, was how to reconcile and how to adapt the religious values to the new scientific changes that were erupting and that were evolving during the Victorian era. You saw how Arnold is lamenting over the loss of religious and moral values from the Victorian society. If you remember, he spoke about the sea of faith, and that sea of faith, the sea was a metaphor for faith, in fact, and he tells us how he sees it receding, how he sees the sea of faith going back and receding into the darkness and leaving behind confusion, chaos, and he brings up the image of armies fighting against each other without knowing why. So he brings to our mind the picture of the Victorian world as a confused and a chaotic society, and that is primarily, as he believes, due to this eroding or this erosion of scientific values, scientific dogmas, the theories of origin that have been explained by Darwin. So those theories, he believed, had corrupted the minds of men and had taken men away from religion. So he being a very religious man, he laments the loss of those values, and I told you how for Arnold these values were important. So, and in order to bring out these values again, or in order to introduce those values again into his society, he wants to introduce the teaching of the Greek poetry, the Greek religion, the Greek literature in schools and colleges of England. And because his main duty was as an educator of the schools of England, so that was what he did. He ran an important school in England, and he revised the whole syllabi, and he introduced the study of Greek classical literature, especially poetry, because he believed that in poetry, it is through poetry that man can eventually come out of those troubles. So he uses poetry, he uses literature to expound his religious and moral values, and he sees it as a replacement of religion in the Victorian society. So he was basically a reformer, as I told you in the previous lecture, and his aim was to reform the society, and his aim was to reintroduce those values which he believed were lost from the Victorian society. With this onslaught of scientific realism and rationalism and enlightenment, as they love to call it in those times. So these values of enlightenment and these values of rationalism, they had corrupted the society, and they had taken the faith away from man. But as in the previous poem, you saw that this was the central theme. This was the main topic of Dover Beach. This battle between the intellectual rationalism or enlightenment against the religious dogmas, against the religious and moral values, that was the main theme oft over beach. We shall see today that in one other poem he talks about, or he refers to, this great debate, great verbal debate between the two intellectual sides, and you shall see that he rebukes both sides for ignorance of ignorance. And today again you shall see that Matthew Arnold is really deeply steeped into the problems of his age, and he rarely writes apart from those problems. Today also we will study one poem, that is the last word, in which you shall see that he's referring to this Victorian dilemma, he's referring to this Victorian problem, and he's referring to these great debates between different intellectuals which are raving, which were maybe raving in his time, and he seems to be fed up with those debates because they lead to nowhere. And the other poem that I'm going to do with you, Growing Old, in that poem we shall see how he's lamenting the loss of youth, and he sees no glory in old age also, and as opposed to the contrary beliefs where old age is seen as as an age where man is bestowed with wisdom and high seriousness. He sees that that's not the case, and he's going to show us the other side of being old, the other feelings that are associated with being old. So first we will study the last word, and then I will look at this other poem with you with the title Growing Old. So let us start with the last word. Now briefly about the poem. The poem, as I've just explained to you, is about this the intellectual debate between the intellectuals which was raving in the time of the Victorian era. So it is about the power play of words and the unending argument, or the argument for the sake of argument. So Arnold appears to be fed up with this empty kind of an argument where one party is only trying to win over the other party through forceful arguments. So he seems not to be impressed by the arguments of either sides. He feels that this is just an attempt to show power over the other, to become dominant over the other. So he describes it as just a power play of words. So these parties, he says, tells us that they are playing with words. And this is an argument only for the sake of argument. It is an argument for the sake of victory. It is an argument for the sake of humiliating the other party. So it is not an argument which is based on rationalism, which is based on reasoning, and where both parties listen to each other and listen to each other's reasoning and accept their own faults wherever they are at fault, and also accept the reasoning given by the others when those reasonings are superior to their own reasoning. So he seems not to be impressed by this kind of an argument, which he describes as meaningless, which he describes as futile, which he describes as empty, just empty words, because they aim only at gaining power over their adversary. And as the title of the poem suggests, the last word, it hints at that fact that everyone wants to have the last word. Everyone wants to be the one to have the last argument, which means everyone wants to be the winner. Everyone wants to come out successfully or out of that debate. So there is no humility. There is only this false pride which makes the argument going. The humility is not there. The ability to accept or acknowledge the other's superiority of arguments or the other reasoning is not there. That is lacking. So it is it's just the pride of the two parties, where nobody is ready to listen to the others, nobody is ready to accept defeat, nobody is ready to show humbleness by accepting the views of the others when they are right. And we shall see that in the poem, poet attacks the two groups. So you shall see that he's not siding with any of the groups. He will attack both the groups who are engaged in the debate, as if in a and the analogy that he gives you is of a battle. So the two groups, debaters, two groups of debaters are engaged in a battle, battle between, like there are two armies engaged in a battle to achieve victory over the other, to completely defeat the other side, to completely erode the other side, to completely destroy the other side. And so his point is that in this kind of debate, the actual point is lost. The actual debate is lost. The actual reasoning is lost. So the message that he gives is that truth is more important than language game. That is the implicit, that is the hidden meaning, as opposed to the explicit. One is the explicit or the apparent meaning, and the other is the implicit or the hidden meaning. So the implicit meaning is that truth is more important. Truth is more important, and also humility is more significant. Humility refers to accepting the reasoning and the points of view of the others when they are right, and accepting your own defeat also at times when you are wrong. So, and that is what Arnold describes as an intellectual, real intellectual debate, as opposed to what those people, those intellectuals in his times were doing. You shall see that the tone of the poem is not serious, and the poem is also not too long. It's a very short poem. It's written in short, crispy sentences. And there are only 4 stanzas in the poem, and all 4 stanzas share the same rhyme scheme, meaning the same pattern in the rhyme scheme. It is A, A, B, B, and then C, C, D, D, then E, E, F, F, and G, G, H, H. You shall see that because of this similar rhyme scheme, the poem has a unity of not just of form, and it also has a unity of theme. So let us now look at the poem. The first stanza, which only consists of 4 lines, and also not really long lines, as you shall see, and the language also is not very difficult, and that's always the case with Arnold. He does not use diction, or he does not use vocabulary that is too difficult, or that is too intellectual, because his message is to put across his beliefs to the audience. So in first stanza he says, creep into thy narrow bed, creep, and let no more be said. Vain thy onset, all stands fast, thou thyself must break at last. So he describes one whole argument, his own argument, in one stanza. He uses the word creep, and he uses the word creep twice, as you can see. He says, creep into thy narrow bed, and then again, creep. And this word creep is not a really dignified word. Creeping is associated with, is associated with animals. It is basically associated with the low image, and when we use this word for humans, like creeping inside a room, we imply that he entered the room without being noticed, and creepily meaning like a snake slithering in quietly. So, but on all fours, creeping meaning. So it brings to your mind that the image of an animal. So it's a lowly image of retreat or of submission. He says, creep into thy narrow bed, go back. This is his first attack on these intellectuals who are having this debate. He says, go back, creep into thy narrow bed, go back or retreat into your own narrow ideas, into your own narrow and self-centered ideas, your own ideas which are only filled up with false pride. So he says, yes, oh yes, go back to your own, creep back into your own narrow mindedness, because you are too proud to accept the views of the others. And then he says, creep again, creep and let no more be said. So creep and then let no more be said. He says, because you are not ready to accept the point of view of the other, the argument that you are engaged in is useless, it is futile. So he says, let no more be said. Because you are not ready to change your viewpoint. You are too enclosed in your own narrow ideas, and you are so vain that you are not ready to admit the point of view of the other. So he says, it is better that you end this argument, that you don't take part in the argument, because this is not the right way to carry on with the argument. So creep back into your own narrow shell. And then he says, vain thy onset. Vain means proud. Okay? And this sense of pride comes from when you know that you are right. This belief that you know that only you are right, and with this belief comes the idea that the others are wrong. So this vanity or this pride brings with it is the opposite of humility. It brings with it this confidence in ourselves, and it shuts our eyes to the views of the others. This is what he says. He says, you're so proud, you're so vain that you think you are right. And so when you open your argument, onset is the beginning, opening. So he says, when you begin your argument, you open your argument, you open the discussion. He says, from the beginning you are vain, from the beginning you are proud, from the beginning you have made up your mind that you are right and others are all wrong. So you see, he's attacking at that mindset, he's attacking at that mentality, and he's attacking those intellectuals in his times who show so much belief in themselves that they are not ready to accept the views of the others. All stands fast. Again, it's connected to the pride. He says that when you are speaking, when you start your argument, you think everybody should stand and listen to you, because what you are saying is right and all the others are wrong. Thou thyself must break at last. You shall see that in all stanzas, Arnold follows the same pattern. In the last line, he's going to give, in each stanza, he's going to give a remark. Here also he says, thou thyself must break at last. So he's advising those who are engaged in the argument. He says, thou thyself must break at last. So he says, you shall, if you don't stop, if you do not let go of your vanity, he says, you shall break at last. So this is his message. This is his message to them. He says, if you do not let go of your vanity, if you do not let go of your pride, if you do not adopt humility, you shall break at last. Just like a tree in the face of the storm, the tree that doesn't bend, it eventually breaks, and the tree that is able to bend does not break. So it's the same analogy that he is conjuring, that he's creating in order to explain the idea. So that was the first stanza where he's criticizing these intellectualists. In the second stanza, he carries his argument further. He says, let the long contention cease. Geese are swans, and swans are geese. Let them have it how they will. Thou art tired, best be still. He says, let the long contention cease. Long contention. Look at the words that he's using. Contention means it's the cause of the argument. It is a fight, the reason for fight between the two. He says, but here he means the argument. He says, let this long fight, let this long battle, let this long discussion, let this long argument cease. Cease means finish, stop. So he says, let it all end now. because it is all useless, let it all end. Because with the word long, he's also giving you the impression that it has gone on for a long, long time. So this should tell you how stubborn both the sides are and how vain and proud both the sides are, that they have continued with this contention, with this argument for a long time now, with none of the sides conceding to the other's points of view, with none of the sides accepting the other's points of view, and with none of the sides accepting defeat. So he says, he implores them, let it all end, let it all finish, let it all stop. Geese are swans and swans are geese. Significant lines. He says, geese are swans. Geese and swans are belong to the same family of birds. Swans are beautiful, huge birds that are associated with the ducks, but geese, but the swans are beautiful and are huge, and mostly they're white. You must have, I'm sure you know about swans, and geese are like ducks, and so they are not as beautiful as swans are, and they are smaller in size. But here when Arnold talks about them, he's using them to explain his view. He's using them to bring to your mind that both parties, both sides are the same, because he says geese are swans, and then he says swans are geese. He says there is no difference between the swans or the geese. Here by swans he means those who think that, you know, who they're superior, and by geese he means the other side, who's yet again engaging in the discussion, but that may be the inferior side. But he says both are the same, both are ignorant, both are vain. So in this battle of words, in this battle of words, he says all are equal. Geese are like swans and swans are like geese. So one interpretation is that both sides are the same. None is superior to the other and none is inferior to the other. So he brings them both on to the equal status. And it may also apply to their argument or the words that they use. He says the words that they throw at each other, that they are, he says, they are also insignificant. They carry no weight, they carry no depth. So they may have their differences, but he says they are all the same. There is no one superior and there is no one which is inferior. Let them have it how they will. And then he's advising us. He says, let them go on, because they will not stop. They will not listen listen to the sane opinion. Let them have it how they will. Let them decide the rule of their arguments. Let them have this discussion. Let them have this argument. Let them have it how they will. He says, thou art tired, best be still. So he's telling us, he's telling the audience, he's telling the Victorian world, you are tired now. You are now tired. You're tired of looking from one side to the other. You're tired from looking at the geese and then at the swans. You're tired of trying to decide which one is right and which one is wrong. He says they have gone on for a long time now. They're still going on, and they will go on even in the future, he says. But we are now tired. You are now tired of their argument, of their debate. Best be still. So he says, let us be indifferent to what they are saying, and let them fight it out as they want, and let us now pay no more attention to them. And then in the third stanza, he says, they out-talked thee, hissed thee, tore thee. Better men fared thus before thee. Fired their ringing shot and passed, hotly charged, and sank at last. In this stanza, he creates the first image of a battle scene for you. Then in the next stanza, you shall see that he he's going to take it further. But here he starts by saying, they out-talked thee, hissed thee, tore thee. Now he's talking about the kind of argument, about the kind of words that the adversaries use against each other. He says, their aim in the argument is to out-talk. The out-talk is to completely shut the other side to silence, to let them say no more in reply or in return to their arguments. He says, hiss thee, tore thee. Now these words we use for wild animals which attack their prey, and then they create the hissing sound, and they tear their opponent, they tear their prey into pieces and eat their flesh. So he's creating that animal kind of imagery here because he wants to show to you that their attitude is not humane, their attitude is not civilized, it is uncivilized, it is uncouth, and it is barbaric. So he says their behavior is more animal-like, it is not humane. So they hiss at you, they make fun of you, and their aim is to tear you to pieces, to bring you to the lowest humiliation, and to attack you to attack you relentlessly, and to attack you remorselessly, and to bring you down is their only aim, is to bring their enemy down is their only aim. So he is hinting at, over here in this stanza, he's hinting at this, the nature of this debate, the nature of the argument that is raging between the two sides especially, but generally between different sides in the Victorian era. You remember I told you that the two sides, the two prominent sides in the Victorian era were those engaged in the intellect, in the in the religious, and the one taking side of the religious and the moral benefits, and the other speaking in favor of the scientific rationalism and enlightenment. So he may be referring to the two sides trying to tear each other to pieces, and each trying to win over the other. He says, better men fare thus before thee, fired their ringing shot and passed, hotly charged and sank at last. This is one complete thought. He says, you need not worry, better men fare thus before thee. He says, so the message that he's giving to us is that we need not be afraid of such kind of an attack, because he says there have been people in the world who had to go through even worse attacks in their lives than you were experiencing now. He says, better men fared thus before we. They went through even more troubles before us, fired their ringing shot and passed hotly charged and sank at last. And he says, what was the result? All these intellectuals, these intellectuals who had engaged in discussions in the past, what happened to them? They also fired their ringing shot. This is a soldier taking an aim through the pistol. So this is firing at the enemy. He says, so just like the soldier firing at his enemy, this intellectual firing his words at his opponent. He says he fires his ringing shot and passed hotly charged. Although he was filled with energy, he was charged with the passion to succeed over his opponent. He says, what happened to that man? He eventually sank. So he says, everybody, the lesson that history tells us, that everybody will eventually pass, will eventually sink, will eventually disappear from history. He says, we no longer hear of those men now, and so the same will be the case now. He says, and this ringing shot can be compared to the bold, proud words of these intellectuals. So in this stanza, his main idea is on the nature of the words, that is or in the nature of the arguments that is used against the opponents, that these intellectuals are using against each other, and the aim is to make fun of the other. The aim is to completely defeat the other, or to tear the other into pieces. So the onslaught is also becomes personal. It's not only an intellectual onslaught. It's not only an intellectual discussion. He says it has become worse than that, and this is why he then tells us that we need not worry, because just like in the past, people with greater arguments have eventually disappeared in the darkness of the history. The same will happen to these intellectuals. In stanza 4, he says, charge once more, then. So he starts with his final message. He says, charge once more, then, and be dumb. Let the victors, when they come, when the forts of folly fall, find thy body by the wall. He's using again a metaphor of fighting armies, and the scene is that of a battle siege, and he uses this imagery to describe the ironical end to this verbal battle between the two groups. He says, charge once more. So charged, he's asking the soldiers are here, the opposing intellectuals. He says, charge once more, attack once more time, and then be dumb. So he says, he's talking about that party which is being hissed at, which the opponents have surrounded from all sides. So the image that he's created for you is that of two armies fighting against each other, and the one is surrounded inside their fort, inside their palace, in fact a castle. In fact, their fort and castle, they're all surrounded by the enemies, their victors from all sides. So they have laid siege around their castle, and this other army is now almost defeated and is surrounded from all sides by the enemy. He's advising them, he says, to make one last effort. He says, charge one more time and then be dumb. Then say no more. Then do no more, he says. Let the victors, this is the army now that surrounded their fort, that has laid siege. He says, let the victors, when they come, and the forts of folly fall. These forts of folly are the false, proud, vain ideas. He says, when these victors, when they come, and when he says these forts of folly fall, he says these forts that both parties have created around them, and both parties have secluded themselves in their different forts. You see what he's done here? He's created for you complicated imagery where these two intellectual sides, these warring factions, they're like armies. Each one has built a fort for themselves, for itself, and each one lives secure in its own fort, and they attack each other, and try and capture each other by attacking the other forts. So he says, when these forts of folly fall, when their empty words they fall, and they can see through the truth, he says, find thy body by the wall. Eventually, he says, what will happen? He says, they will see your body lying by the wall. So these victors will find that they're defeated. They are actually defeated, and their forts, the false ideas, these high words that they had secluded themselves in, and these high words behind whose safety they had hid themselves, when these high words and their high ideas, when they all collapse to ground, when they all shatter to ground, he says they will find their own dead bodies. So these two sides, these two warring factions that he's talking about, he tells them that their battle is futile. He tells them that their struggle is futile. Their aim is to dominate the other. Their aim is to completely destroy the other. Their aim is to hold power over the other. And this is what Matthew Arnold is disgusted with. And this is why in the last stanza he describes this discussion as forts of folly. And he says when these when these sides, their forts fall, their walls are shattered, and they all lie exposed, they are dead. We shall find them dead. So without their walls of safety, without these high words, they are like dead bodies. Okay. So he has attacked these sides who are engaged in the intellectual discussion, and he tells us that in such a debate there is no winner. There's no winner. So although he uses for us, or he in fact creates for us the analogy of a battle scene in which there is always an army which is victorious and the other is a defeated army. But here he tells us that in the debate, intellectual debate or in an argument, there is no clear-cut winner. And when forts of folly, when the forts of both of follies of both sides, they fall, their own bodies are exposed, and their own dead bodies are exposed. So their own false ideas are exposed, their own weaknesses are exposed. So they are only hid behind these high bold words, but otherwise they are meaningless. So there is one message is that there is no clear-cut winner in this intellectual debate. So there is no point in carrying the argument further. And as we saw that the two fighting armies are compared to the warring intellectuals, and each holding their final ground till final victory. And the image of fighting armies was also used in the Dover Beach. And if you remember, he called them both the ignorant armies. And it is important that you compare this fact with Dover Beach. In the Dover Beach also he tells you that when the sea of faith has receded, the world has been overcome with darkness, and in that darkness he says there's confusion and chaos, and there are armies fighting against each other, but not knowing why they're fighting against each other. So there also he was referring to this intellectual debate, and he said the people engaged in debate without actually knowing what they're saying, what they're talking about. So it was a discussion for the sake of discussion, and he described them as both ignorant. So here also you see he says that both sides are ignorant. So these are the ignorant armies fighting for no reason and fighting for no true claim. And his message is only truth and humility is of high value and of high seriousness. So the message that he gives through his poem is that truth is the real winner, and humility is of real value. And by humility he means the ability to listen to the other, the ability to accept the point of view of the other when the other is right, and the ability to accept defeat when you are wrong. That is what we define as humility. So which Arnold does not find in any party here. That is why he says geese are swans and swans are geese. Both are same, and there's no one that is superior to the other. Both are equal in his eyes. So this was Arnold, and this was his discussion on the last word. And we saw how in the poem he talks about the Victorian dilemma, how he talks about this great intellectual debate going on in his times, in his age, and how Arnold does not celebrate this, does not seem to be happy with that, and does not uphold that. We shall start with his other poem now, and that the title of that poem is Growing Old. In this poem, as I told you in the beginning, he talks about how it feels like to grow old, and he is going to change, and he's going to show to us how some of the ideas or some of the concepts associated with old age, how they're wrong. He's going to show to us how old age is not an age of glory. It is not at the time of glory. It is not the time or it's not the age of wisdom. He shall show the weaknesses of his age, of this age. So let us start. It is a simple poem, and there's no complication in the poem. The ideas are not complicated, and the language itself is not complicated also. So I shall go over it quickly. So in the first stanza of the poem, he tells us that growing old is more than just losing physical beauty. This is one phenomena. What happens in old age? In fact, what is, let me first ask you, what is old age? What do we mean by old age? We know that old age is followed by youth, youth followed by adulthood, adulthood is followed by old age. And we know that when we are old, our physical body changes, our emotional and mental states also change. And so overall, there's an overall change in the physical as well as in the mental states. And as far as the physical state is concerned, we know that the beauty is lost. We know that much of the shine, freshness is gone. So that is one loss. And as far as the mental and emotional states are concerned, they are also less sharper now. In the old age, they are less sharp. And in the youth, while we are more energetic and we feel more and we can think more clearly, in old age all of that changes. Our sensations become blurry, and we cannot think clearly. So that again is a loss. So it's these losses that Arnold is going to draw our attention to. So he starts the poem with a question. He says, what is it to grow old? What is it to grow old? Is it to lose the glory of the form, the lustre of the eye? Is it for beauty to forego her wreath? Yes, but not for this alone. So he asks you a question. He says, what do we mean by growing old? Then another question, he says, when we say we've grown old, do we mean that we have lost the glory of the form or the lustre of the eye? So this is the external beauty that he's talking about. He says, do we mean that when we say when we've grown old, do we mean that we have lost our external beauty? We've lost the glory, the beauty of the form, the physical form, and the lustre, meaning the shine, the light of the eyes. He says, do we mean that we have lost that? The lustre of the eye refers to the beauty of the eye, but also refers to the hope. The light from the eye is referring to the hope. He says, so have we lost all hope when we become old? And then another question, he says, is it for beauty to forego her wreath? Does it mean that we lose all beauty? That we lose all beauty when we become old? So here the beauty is personified as a beautiful lady, you can see, who's wearing a wreath of flowers on her forehead, on her head, over here. So he says, is it like that beauty, it has let go of the wreath, the crown, the beautiful crown that it was wearing? So in other words, what he's saying is that when we talk about old age, do we mean that we have lost the external beauty? Have we lost the beauty of our body? Have we lost the beauty of the eyes, or the hope in our inner eyes, and all external beauty? Then he gives you the answer in the last line. He says yes. He says yes, it is true. It is true that when we are old, that in the old age we lose our the beauty of our physical form. But then he says, but not for this alone. So he says, but there is more that we lose. So he says yes to the loss of beauty in the physical form, but he says that is not all. We lose more. And what is that? He says, in fact, he asks you more questions. He says, is it to feel our strength, not our bloom only, but our strength decay? Is it to feel each limb grow stiffer, every function less exact, each nerve more weakly strung? So two questions he asks you again. He says, and in this stanza he's talking about the mental strength also. He brings in the mental strength, mental and the physical strengths. First, in the first stanza it was all about beauty, but now he's talking about the strength. And he says, is it to feel our strength, not our bloom? Bloom means beauty. So is it to feel that alongside our beauty or our youth, our strength has also decayed, our strength has also diminished, our strength is also gone? And then the second question he says, is it to feel each limb grow stiffer, every function less exact, each nerve more weakly strung? So he's telling us how the strength weakens, but he asks us a question. He says, do we feel when we grow old that our limbs have become stiffer? When he says limbs becoming stiffer, he means they're not as agile as they used to be. They're not as active as they used to be. When we are old, we are not as quick as we used to be, because our limbs grow stiff. But that is also due to the diseases that in old age we have. Sometimes they're more related to the diseases in the bones, like arthritis and other forms. So where the limbs grow stiff and there's difficulty in moving the limbs. It says every function is exact. So our functions, whatever we achieve to do, whatever we want to do, he says whatever we want to accomplish, it is not completely done naturally, because we're slow, we are tired, our functions are also less exact. We miss our aim most of the time. We try to lift up a pen from the table, and we may be able to do it with less difficulty, because our eyes have grown weaker, because our own strength has weakened, so we may not even target the object with clarity. Each nerve more weakly strung, and our nerves, he says, have become weak also. So he says in this stanza that in old age our strength also leaves us. Our beauty, our youth leaves us in old age, but then he says our strength also leaves us in old age. And it's strength, not just the physical strength, but also the mental strength, because he's talking about your nerves also. In the third stanza, he answers these two questions that he put up in the second stanza. And the answer is yes. So he says again, he begins the third stanza with yes. He says, yes, this and more. He says, yes, this is right, we lose our physical and mental strengths, but more. But it is not what in youth we dreamed it would be. It is not to have a life mellowed and softened as with sunset glow, a golden day's decline. Now he says there is more that we lose in old age. And he says old age is not at all as we thought it would be in our youth. He says this is not what in youth we dreamed it would be. So it is not what we had been told it would be like. It is not to have a life mellowed and softened as with sunset glow. He compares the old age with the setting sun, and the youth is compared to the full day, where the sun is in all its glory. So he just says that in our old age we have become mellowed and softened. We have lost our strength, so we are mellowed. And he says our beauty is gone, so we have softened. And just like the dying sunset, just like the dying sun, which has lost its glow, which has lost its power. So just like the setting sun gives us a sad decline of the might of the sun, the mighty sun, as it was in the daytime, as it is in the daytime, looking as a powerful part of nature. When it is setting, it appears to be mellowed, and it appears to be softened, and it appears not as threatening as it used to be in daytime. So he says, just in the same way, in old age also, he says, we have mellowed down and we have softened. And he describes it as a decline. It is a decline, he says, of a golden day, of the golden age. This golden day is youth. So he says, and the old age is described as a decline of that golden age, of that golden period, of that golden youth. So in this stanza he tells us that in old age we also lose, and we are conscious that we have lost the glory of our youth. It is not to see the world as from a height, with rapt prophetic eyes, and heart profoundly stirred, and weep and feel the fullness of the past, the years that are no more. In this stanza, he's comparing again the youth, old age with youth. And he says, it is not to see the world as from a height, with rapt prophetic. So in the first two lines, he discredits the ideas and the notions that we have about old age. He says, like people say that in old age we become wise, and because we have so much experience behind us, we are somehow placed on some high pedestal, and we know all about life. So he says, it is not that we view the world from a height, because we have traversed all stages of the world, and it's not that we have become a prophet. It's not that we look back now with prophetic eyes, he says, or we are able to look into the future with prophetic eyes and make predictions about the future, because we have gathered so much knowledge and experience from our past life. He says it is not like that. It is not that we become sages, or it's not that we become a prophet in the old age. And he says, and heart profoundly stirred, and we don't have a heart, or we don't have feelings or sentiments which are profoundly stirred. Stirred means moved. He says, now that we have gathered so much experience and we know so much about life, it's not that we have a heart which moves easily when it sees things around it. That's not so. He says, and weep and feel the fullness of the past, the years that are no more. What happens, he says? We weep and feel the fullness of the past, the years that are no more. And what happens in the old age, he says? We are weeping and we are feeling the fullness of the past. We remember the past days which were full, and we regret over those years that are now no more with us. So he says the hope and the determination of the youth is all gone, and only leaves in the old age one is only left with regrets. Then in the next stanza he says, it is to spend long days and not once feel that we were ever young. It is to add, immured, in the hot prison of the present, month to month with weary pain. Now he makes it even worse in this stanza. He says, in old age, time doesn't pass. Time seems to stop. And he describes the old age like a prison. He describes it as a prison, and the old person is in that is a prisoner in that prison, and his time stops. Time for him stops, and he will be there for a long time. He says it is to spend long days and not once feel that we were ever young. So what happened in the youth? He says we don't remember. The pain of the present old age is so much that the glory of the young youth is forgotten, he says. Not once do we feel that we were ever young. The days pass so slowly, they become so long in the old age that youth seems to be far off, almost forgotten. It is to add immured in the hot prison of the present, month to month with weary pain. So he describes that present, that old age, as a prison. So he says in that old age where man, of which man is a prisoner, he says he spends his time from month to month in extreme pain, in extreme solitude and in extreme pain. So you see the misery, the loss that he's talking about, that it fills one with pain. So he's not describing old age as normally we describe it as. He's describing it as a stage which is filled with isolation and which is filled with pain. And then lastly he says, it is to suffer this and feel but half and feebly what we feel. Deep in our hidden heart festers the dull remembrance of a change, but no emotion, none. So in old age he further tells us that feelings and emotions are also, they become dull. They're so dull that they're almost dead. So he says it is to suffer this and feel but half and feebly what we feel. So he says apart from this suffering, he says we feel, but he says feebly what we feel. Our feelings become feeble, weak and dull, and that is due to certain diseases in old age, and that's also maybe because of the nerves that slow down when we are old, and our senses which slow down when we are old. So all bodily functions, body organs also become old. So, and they're working slow when we are old. So this is why he says emotions and feelings are also aroused slowly and they become dull. Deep in our hidden heart festers a dull remembrance of a change, but no emotion, none. So he says, and although inside our heart, inside our heart is hidden, he says it festers. Festering is the slow burning of dull remembrance. He says we do have a very dull, weak remembrance of a change, of our youth. He says, but he says we don't feel any emotion. It does not arouse any emotions. Even he says that the remembering old times, because they become so dull, because they have appear to be so separated in time from us, because they appear so far away, far removed from us, that they are almost as if they don't belong to us. He says that they do not even arouse an emotion. We don't even feel an emotion when we remember our past. So for him, the old age is like for him, old age is like this a drying up of emotions. It is drying up of feelings. And then he says, it is last stage of all, when we are frozen up within and quiet the phantom of ourselves, to hear the world applaud the ghost, hollow ghost, which blamed the living man. And then he tells us, and we know it already, that old age is a last stage. It is a last stage. First, and those last stage of what? The last stage of a man's development, from childhood to youth, to adolescence, to youth, and then to old age. He says it is this last age, and at this last stage we are frozen up within. Frozen up means dried up. Frozen up is like brings to our minds the death of emotions, the death of feelings, the death of memories, and also to do with the with our movement, where our limbs becoming stiff, the physical stiffness of our limbs due to these diseases, maybe arthritis or some other disease, Alzheimer, which is a disease of the nerves, so or which is also associated with the memory loss. So he says we become completely frozen up, and quite we become like the phantom. We are like the ghosts of ourselves. So he's comparing old age, a person in old age, to some kind of a ghost. And he uses the word phantom, which is a strange word to use, in fact. He says, to hear the world applaud the Holy Ghost which blamed the living man. So this, the irony is, he says, that the world applauds this hollow ghost. The world puts this hollow ghost in esteem. The whole world describes this hollow ghost as a sage, as a prophet. The world applauds it, he says, but you see he uses the word hollow ghost. And hollow ghost, and hollow describes emptiness, and you see ghost is not a living man, but here he's using it, the word phrase is used for old man. Which blame, to hear the world applaud the hollow ghost which blamed the living man. He says it is a strange world that we live in, which applauds these old people, which applauds their judgment, which takes their judgments to be true, which takes their words to be prophetic, which takes their words to be full of wisdom, but blames the living men. By living men he's talking about those who have physical and mental strength, those who still have emotions and passions with them, those who can think clearly. He says, so he's talking about the youthful, the men who are still young. So the irony is encapsulated in these two lines when he says, this is a strange world that we live in, where the old man whom he has just described to you, who has whose senses have become dull, whose movements have become restricted, and whose emotions have all dried up, and who's lost his glory of form and glory of emotions, and who's become like a hollow ghost, he says. Why should his words have more weightage than, he says, that of young people or of a young energetic mind? So in the poem we see how he describes when we are old, how do we feel physically, mentally and emotionally. So he gives you a description of how in old age the physical, mental and emotional deterioration occurs. And as I told you earlier on, very simple language is used in the poem. And also we saw that throughout the poet does not glorify old age. He does not glorify it as the age of wisdom or as the age of prophecy. And in fact he's describing it as more as an age of misery and as an age of pain. And it is not just the loss of physical beauty, but he says it is also the loss of feelings and emotions. The old man has not just lost his physical form, but he has also lost his feelings, and he's also lost his emotions. So he has also lost his ability to make judgment, to make rational judgments. So he's not the prophet, he's not the sage as we think him to be. He has in fact become more like a ghost. He's more like a hollow ghost. So this is how Arnold it describes to us and creates for us a new picture of old age. which is different from the way old age was normally perceived. But you can see he's giving high value to the judgments of the youth. So this was his second poem, Growing Old, which breaks away from lots of previous traditions, as you saw, about old age. So in this lecture, in today's lecture, we have analyzed two of his Arnold's poems, and with this we conclude Matthew Arnold. The three poems on Matthew Arnold that I've done with you, starting with Dover Beach, then The Last Word, and now Growing Old, you can well understand that Matthew Arnold was basically the voice of his era. He was a voice of his age. He was a spokesman of his age. He was a great Victorian critic, and he was a great Victorian writer. He was a great Victorian poet, and he's left his mark in the Victorian age, in the Victorian literature. And he talks about the great dilemmas of his age. And he was a moralist at heart, we saw, because he wants poetry to be used to spread the moral message. And in that way, we can describe his poetry as reflections of his age. We can describe his works as reflecting his age. And in his poems, the language is deliberately kept simple. Matthew Arnold's main function was to expose the ills of his society, and was to get his message across to as many people as he could. And I have mentioned earlier on also that he was the educator also, and he wanted to reform the young minds. He wanted to change the young minds, and he wanted to keep them away from the influence of the Enlightenment and the intellectual rationalism that was gaining hold in the Victorian era. So this was Matthew Arnold, a prominent figure of the Victorian age. And in the next lecture, I will start with another poet, and we will in fact start with Tennyson, and you shall see he's as another Victorian. Tennyson does not share the same concerns with Matthew Arnold, and he will come out as a different kind of a poet. So I shall meet you again in the next lecture with the other poet and with some other poems. I shall take leave now. Thank you very much.